Welcome to this online lecture for Western Civ 1. Today we are going to be talking about two of the earliest civilizations in Western civilization, and that is Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now, on this first slide, I'd like you to take a few notes. Just pay attention to the things that are listed there under things you should be able to place on a map, because these are things you might be held accounted for on a quiz or an exam. So make sure that in your work that you are able to locate Mesopotamia, the Sumerian civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Nile, Upper Egypt, and Lower Egypt on a map. And that would be a blank map if I were to give it to you. Then, in addition, you also should be able to answer a couple of questions at the end of this lecture. What is cuneiform and how is it connected to agriculture? And what are the similarities and differences between civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt? So most of our lectures, our online lectures, will begin this way with a number of things that I want you to keep track of. So make sure that you are noting these things on the first slide. So anyway, with that, let's get to it. Agriculture is what made civilization possible. It did so by making it possible for people to better control their food supply. Rather than relying on hunting and gathering, human beings could grow their own food. The development of agriculture occurred in something called the Agricultural Revolution. Now, it's important to know that this revolution was not a sudden event. It occurred over thousands of years and in many different places. Most anthropologists date the Agricultural Revolution to about 10,000 BCE, or near the end of the last ice age. A warming of the climate may have, in fact, made agriculture possible. The Agricultural Revolution had a huge impact on human beings and on society. For example, the Agricultural Revolution made it possible for permanent settlements to be formed. In other words, towns and cities. The Agricultural Revolution made it possible for larger populations to develop. Remember, hunter and gatherer populations typically were, a hunter or gatherer band was typically no more than 25 to 30 people. Now they can have hundreds, if not thousands of people living in one area. The Agricultural Revolution is going to have an impact on the creation of government and law. It will help with the development of organized religion. It will also help create social stratification. In other words, what we would call today the class system. And finally, the Agricultural Revolution is why writing will be developed. So this is a huge transformation in human life, and that's what we're going to that's some of the things we're going to see how that transformation is going to occur in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The focus of today's lecture will be two of those civilizations. Mesopotamia, also known as the Fertile Crescent, which stretched from the Persian Gulf in the east all the way up through Iraq and Iran and down into Lebanon and Syria in the west, and the civilization of Egypt, which is in northeastern Africa and stretches along the Nile River. We're going to begin with Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia is a Greek word which means the land between the rivers. So what were those rivers? Well, those rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which empty into the Persian Gulf on the eastern side of Mesopotamia. If you were to choose a place for Western civilization to begin, you probably would not have chosen Mesopotamia. The region, which is now part of modern-day Iraq, receives little rainfall. Temperatures average between 104 and 120 degrees in the summer. Moreover, there are few natural resources, or at least few natural resources that ancient peoples would have recognized. What I mean is that while today the region is valued for its oil, 8,000 years ago it had very few of the things that ancient peoples valued. There was little metal and very few trees. So why did ancient peoples develop one of the world's first civilizations in this region? Moreover, the true rivers were not so great either. They regularly flooded, sometimes with disastrous results, destroying homes and entire cities. So once again, we're left with this question. Why is this the birthplace of Western civilization? It has to do with one resource that Mesopotamia did have, and that is rich soil. The floods from the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that could be so damaging also deposited a thick layer of rich river bottom silt on Mesopotamian fields. Over the centuries, Mesopotamian peoples figured out how to build dams and reservoirs that could control and trap floodwaters until they could be used to water the fields. So that took care of the fact that it was a desert. You have water, you can grow crops as long as you have water, even if you're in the middle of a desert. And so they took care of providing water for their fields through the creation of dams and irrigation networks. Now, the construction of these dams and irrigation networks were massive endeavors that required the harnessing of technology and labor. And these needs further encouraged the development of governments, which alone could organize these tasks efficiently. So, once again, we're starting to see some of the elements that are necessary for civilization, or at least are the outcome of civilization. We have resources that drew people there. In this case, the resource was rich soil. Second of all, once the peoples figured out how to use the river, how to use the water that was flowing through the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, once they could harness that for irrigation, and once they can control the floodwaters, they could also develop their civilization. But they could only do this once they had a government that could organize the construction of dams, the construction of irrigation networks, etc. Now, Mesopotamia is the name of a region. It is not the name of a people, a country, or a culture. That's one thing we have to understand. In fact, Mesopotamia is the home of many, many civilizations over the millennia. Now, the first of these civilizations to arise were a people known as the Sumerians. The map to the right shows the location of the Sumerian civilization, which was at the far southeastern end of the Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers empty into the Persian Gulf. In short, this is the heart of the nation of Iraq today. Sumerian civilization first arose around 6500 BCE, but reached its peak between 3600 and 3000 BCE. Now, the Sumerians were not a united empire or nation. Instead, the Sumerians lived in independent city-states. They traded with one another and fought wars with one another. We know this because Sumerian cities were surrounded by high walls with defense towers. Obviously, these people had something they wanted to protect. These were also modern civilizations in other ways as well. Like we previously discussed, society was divided into haves and have-nots. There were farmers and traders, artists, priests, and religious officials. Some families had more wealth and power than others. There were also slaves, most likely prisoners of war, or those who had unpaid debts. Moreover, cities, the largest of which had a population of about 50,000 people, were dirty and diseased places. Some of these cities are listed on the slide. Some of the cities included Uruk, Ur, Lachish, and there were others as well. The Sumerians had another feature of civilization: trade. Like I said, Mesopotamia was not known for lots of resources. Thus they had to trade for pretty much everything. Their trade routes stretched as far east as Afghanistan and even into India. The Sumerians were also the first culture in Western civilization to develop the skill of writing. Like I said earlier, writing developed as a way to track agricultural production and trade. These records were scratched into clay tablets using symbols known as cuneiform. Still, don't get the impression that just because the Sumerians invent the process of writing, that most Sumerians could read. Reading and writing remained a skill that only the richest and most important members of society knew. Most ordinary Sumerians relied on oral transmission of ideas and stories. Another area where the Sumerians reflect our description of civilization is in the realm of religion. Like most ancient peoples, the Sumerians were polytheistic. Moreover, most of these gods were connected to nature in one way or another. Some scholars believe that the Sumerians had more than 3,600 different gods. but really only a few were of great importance. For example, there was Ishtar, goddess of war and fertility. There was Enki, the god of fresh water. And there was Enlil, god of storms. One thing we have to understand if we are to understand ancient religions is that these peoples did not see their gods the way most of us do today. Christian, Jews, and Muslims, among others, argue that God, or Allah, or Yahweh, wants human beings to behave ethically. Many argue that God rewards those who are good and just. Now, that's not the way the Sumerians saw their gods. The Sumerian gods were selfish and really didn't care about human behavior. Still, one could appease the gods or keep them happy by offering them sacrifices. And when the gods were happy, harvests were good, battles were won, and life went smoothly. The Sumerian civilization went into a decline after 3000 BCE and disappeared entirely after 2000 BCE. Why? It's unclear. However, some historians argue that it might have been an environmental disaster. While irrigation can work to supply crops with much needed water, it can also destroy soil if not used properly. Dissolved minerals are deposited in the soil after the water evaporates. At the same time, water can draw similar minerals to the surface over time. Ultimately, these minerals can poison the soil and make it impossible for the crops necessary for civilization to grow. Now let's move a little bit further to the west, because at about the same time the Sumerians were building their civilization in Mesopotamia, another great civilization was rising in northeast Africa. Egypt bore a number of similarities to Mesopotamia. Like the latter, Egypt was a civilization in a desert that was built around a river. That river was, of course, the Nile. The Nile is unusual in that it flows from south to north. Initially, Egypt was divided into Upper Egypt, which was in the south, and Lower Egypt, which bordered on the Mediterranean Sea to the north. The Nile runs more than 4,200 miles from south to north. Like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Nile also floods. The difference is that the floods were predictable and not destructive. The floods would begin after the harvest so that no crops would be destroyed. This also meant that flood control dams and irrigation networks were unnecessary. Moreover, once the Nile's waters receded, they left behind a rich soil, just in time for the next season's planting. This cycle was known as the, quote, gift of the Nile, end quote. But the Nile's benefits went beyond agriculture. The river also made it easy to travel from one end of Egypt to the other. One needed only follow the currents north to move in that direction. In contrast, gentle winds could push a sailing vessel in the opposite direction, in other words, north to south. Finally, the Nile also had an impact on settlement patterns in Egypt. Because of the richness of the Nile Valley, Egyptians spread evenly throughout the region. Moreover, with deserts on both sides and the Mediterranean Sea to the north, Egyptians did not have to worry about clustering into large cities for protection. Moreover, unlike the independent Sumerian cities, Egypt was a unified kingdom beginning in the year 3100 BCE. That was the year that Upper and Lower Egypt were united. Egypt's government was a monarchy led by a king known as the pharaoh. The pharaoh was thought to be a living god. Moreover, he owned all of Egypt. Every field, every house, every grain of wheat belonged to the pharaoh. In exchange, Egyptians expected their pharaoh to preserve order in the world. For example, the so-called Old Kingdom was overthrown in 2190 BCE after a series of droughts caused the Nile to dry up in places. Without their annual floods, Egypt could not feed itself, and the people starved. 500 years later, the Middle Kingdom was overthrown after a foreign invasion greatly weakened Egyptian society. Another invasion led to the collapse of the New Kingdom in the year 1081 BCE. Now, while incest was a taboo in Egyptian society, and really most other ancient societies, it was permissible among pharaohs. In fact, because it was critical to keep royalty in the blood, it was not unusual for a pharaoh to marry his sister or his daughter. It was also believed that the pharaoh was a god. This does not mean that the Egyptians thought their king was immortal. Instead, they believed that the pharaoh was a